before we begin the remarks, I have imposed upon members of our choir at a very busy time of year. I heard their concert at St. Mary's Parish a couple weeks ago, and I got a little bug in my head that I wanted them to sing Newman's hymn, Lead Kindly Light. So I asked them just a couple days ago, and they were all enthusiastic in their affirmation. So I'm very, very grateful to them. I don't know how many of you know this hymn or have heard this hymn, but I'll just read to you the very brief passage from Newman's Apologia about the origin of this. He goes to Italy, and if you've read, our students all read the Apologia, he gets very sick while he's there. So he writes, "Before starting from my inn the morning of May 26th, I sat down on my bed and began to sob violently. My servant who had acted as my nurse asked what ailed me. I could only answer, I have a work to do in England. I was aching to get home, yet for want of a vessel, I was kept at Palermo for 3 weeks. I began to visit the churches, and they calmed my impatience, though I did not attend any services. I knew nothing of the presence of the Blessed Sacrament there." This is prior to Newman's conversion, although it's an important, crucial step on the road to that conversion. "Then it was I wrote the lines, 'Lead Kindly Light.'" So that is, in short, the origin of this hymn. So without further ado, members of the Thomas More Choir. Thank you.
Well, before I get into Newman, I just want to say thank you to people who have come up to me and told me how much they like the prayerful and the papal posses. It's a very weird thing to do TV frequently because people come up to you and they recognize you. There's a kind of an asymmetry, but you don't know who they are, of course. And it gets to such levels of absurdity that I was coming out of Mass at my own parish on a Saturday morning not long ago. And a very nice couple came up to me and said, "Oh, welcome. It's great to see you. But what are you doing here?" And I had to inform them, I live here. People who are on TV actually live in places. And I've also learned that not everybody loves the posses. This may surprise this crowd, of course, but I can tell you. I remember I was coming out of the oratory in London a couple of years ago after Latin Mass, and a kind of eccentric-looking figure with a strange cast in his eye came up to me and said, "You look like that guy I see on TV often." And I knew to say to him, "What do you think of that guy?" I said, "Oh, I liked him." I said, "Yeah, that's me." It's the life of being on TV. I want to thank Amy and others for organizing this conference because Newman, I think, is a person of absolute and endless fascination. I've been told I have to stick to my text so that I can stay within the time. And I have to say this is a real penance for me because those of us who do TV, we're used to just blabbing and blabbing and blabbing. I'm going to try to read this text. I don't often stick close to text, but I'll try not to make it too long. Because Newman is truly an inspired and inspiring figure. If you've ever read him at all, you know exactly what I mean. And we could have several sessions to try to just begin to appreciate the achievements of John Henry Newman, who's clearly the greatest theologian who's ever written in the language, our English language, as a native speaker. I think he not only is he the greatest theologian, he's much, much more than as well. And as Amy just mentioned, he was just recently, in November 1st, I was in Rome when he was named a doctor of the church. There have only been 38 doctors of the church in the whole history of Christianity. That's billions of people, and the church has only selected 38 of all those billions to become doctors. And doctor of the church, of course, does not mean somebody who makes house calls or does CPR. It means somebody who's a teacher. And Newman is clearly that. Now, for me, Newman is a personal presence in my life and has been for many, many years. When I was writing, I've written now 2 books about modern martyrdom, and I gave both. I was supposed to give this new one to Pope Francis, but he died the week that we were there. But I did give my previous one to St. John Paul II back in 2000. That was the Jubilee year in 2000. And as I was writing that book, I realized that I had to have something that would anchor me as I was going through all this material. Terrible things happening to Catholics all around the world, but also inspiring things at the same time. In fact, I remember after one lecture, a woman came up to me and said, "Weren't you depressed reading about all those people who were martyred?" And I said, "You know, it had never even crossed my mind, these holy and heroic people." But I decided the anchor that I needed was John Henry Newman. And so I took, some of you probably are familiar with the Ignatius Press parochial and plain sermons. It's a brick of a book. It's about this thick. I wanted to bring it, but I already had so many books in my suitcase I couldn't fit it in. But I decided that I would read one sermon by Newman every morning before I started writing about the martyrs. And it became a problem because I would read one, and then I would want to read 2, and maybe 3. And after all, one had to write the book and actually have it ready to give to the Pope in a few minutes. So he's that kind of figure. And if you want actually an introduction, and we're going to talk about some other books, and I'm sure Edward will as well. But if you want an introduction to Newman, those sermons are a good way in, because even when he's a Protestant, he's such a remarkable figure. His language is a little ornate, for us these days. But once you wade into those, I think you'll be captivated, and you ought to. So I decided, I don't know that there wasn't a little bit of impish perversity in this, but I decided what I want to talk about tonight is the heart of John Henry Newman. I saw that Edward wanted to talk about the Augustinian side of, I'm sorry, the Thomistic side of John Henry Newman, and I said to myself, maybe I will talk about the more Augustinian, the heart of John Henry Newman. And I wanted to explain what it means when Newman talks about the heart. One of his Latin mottos, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this actually, is when he was made a cardinal, he had inscribed on his cardinational shield the Latin phrase cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. And I'll explain in a second where I think that goes, because I think this is a kind of a golden thread that can take us through some more complex material in Newman. By the way, just incidentally, when Leo XIII became Pope, Leo XIII, not the 14th we have now, someone asked him, what direction is your papacy going to go in? And he said, watch the people that I appoint as cardinals. And guess who was the first cardinal he appointed? John Henry Newman. And I think that the way that the two of them kind of come together there tells us something about the greatness both of the cardinal and the greatness of Leo XIII. Now, the heart. The heart in Newman obviously doesn't just mean feelings. In fact, while he thought feelings were important, and they are important for all of us, if we use them properly, he said in what is called his Biglietto speech, this was the speech that he gave when he was named a cardinal by Leo, that he had made many mistakes in his life. But, and I'm quoting here, one great mischief I have from the very first opposed myself. For 30, 40, 50 years, I have resisted to the best of my powers the spirit of liberalism and religion. Never did Holy Church need champions against it more sorely than now, when, alas, it is an error overspreading as a snare the whole earth. Liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, that one creed is as good as another, and that this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, in this view, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous. And it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems to me quite a good description of America in 2026, as much as it did Newman in the 19th century. Now, what you can probably tell from that quotation is there is a lot that begins to emerge in Newman in this account of faith, what the heart engaging the faith is. Now, it's clear that if we don't feel love for God and for his church and for his the other Christians who we get to know, at least sometimes, we'd be lacking in some respects. And we have to wrestle with this because the church tells us truths that lots of us at times don't want to hear, obviously. They can cut across not only our favorite vices and sins, but even certain of our loves and attachments. We say, for example, that we love Jesus or God, the Father, but it's usually on our own terms that we want to do that, right? It's not the ones that God himself has revealed to us. As I was putting this text together, I was reminded of a book that Monsignor Charles Pope, who's a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, put together recently. It's a book called The Hell There Is. It's about teachings about hell, and he quotes a lot of sayings by Jesus himself. And a woman came up to him, he said, after he gave a lecture on this book, and she said to him, "That is not the Jesus that I know." And he said, "Yes, ma'am, that's precisely the problem." It was very clear. I mean, it's not just odd cases. All of us like to bend those Christian truths that make it hard for us to. So we do this, and actually this is the whole drama of the Christian life, right? Because Christianity is made for sinners, and we're all sinners. And it consists in trying to understand and then follow more deeply the divine heart. If there's a heart speaking to heart, it's the divine heart speaking to the human heart. as well as, of course, us speaking to one another. And it's a kind of what the French call a sentimental education. We begin little by little to make our feelings begin to accord with the truths that we know. Now that sometimes sounds easy because we have 2,000 years of Christian tradition behind us, but if you've tried to live all that, you realize what, at least in my experience, the intellectual side of this is fairly easy. And I think we'll see how Newman understands that. The living of that intellectual truth is where the drama takes place. The growth into spiritual wisdom, the heart speaking to heart, is a matter of long and hard work, especially for those of us who are not saints. Now, I just want to very quickly, I know a lot of you are probably familiar with Newman, but I'm going to just very quickly sketch out some important things about his life, because what he experienced in his life had an important impact on what he actually wrote in this big teaching. The family was a fairly well-off family. His father was a banker when Newman was born. The bank failed, and his father became a brewer. I was telling a friend of mine that, and he was saying, I hope those were alcoholic beverages that he was brewing. I said to him, don't worry, they were Catholic beverages, even though the family was Protestant. But around the age of 15, the family wasn't particularly religious. Around the age of 15, he had something of a vision, is what I think we should call it. A vision of the deeper realities behind the world as we see it. And he was to have inscribed on his tombstone later another Latin phrase that's worth knowing about him. Ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem. From shadows and images into truth. And I think that, I'll come back to this at the end, but I think that what we need to kind of notice at that beginning is that there's a kind of, you could call it mystical. I had a priest friend who didn't like the term mystical because he said that it's an experience that begins in mist and ends in schism. But it is kind of a mystical vision that he has, and it's in accord with that quotation from the Biglietto speech where he says that the important thing is for truth in religion. So he sees something that he regards as the truth. If you read the Apologia, and it's really worth wrestling with that, so it's a long book, it's a hard book, but if you read it, what he says himself there is that three things began to emerge in his life, his religious life, okay? One, we've already heard, that truth in religion is fundamental, okay? That anything else was not really a religion in the way it thought. The second is that the truth requires a church, an authoritative church, so that we have a visible presence of truth in the world. And if you think about, Protestant sects that read the Bible, they of course read it in very different ways. They head off in all sorts of different directions. And if there isn't an authority that tells us about what God has revealed, then there's no revelation at all. So a church is quite important. And the third thing that he says in the Apologia, and this is of course before he becomes a Catholic, the third thing that he believed of these three important points is that the Catholic Church was not that church. He will change, of course, as he goes on in his life. Instead, what was going on in England at the time was what Matthew Arnold called the regarding of religion as morality tinged with religion. And for Newman, this was absolutely anathema. Now, interestingly, Newman was a very sensitive person. And if you read his Apologia, you'll see the intense friendships and love he had for his friends at Oxford. He went to Oxford, which was then probably the greatest university in the world, or certainly one of them. He was very successful there. And he was elected to be a fellow of Oriel College, which was kind of like the height of educational achievement and intellectual prowess in the England of his time. And he studied theology. He was ordained an Anglican minister. And he became famous, even as an Anglican, because of his sermons, those sermons I mentioned earlier. You can go to St. Mary's in High Street in Oxford, and there's a plaque that it still commemorates Newman's sermons. I read from contemporary accounts that he wasn't kind of a great speaker, but what he said was so powerful that he became famous in Oxford at the time for his sermons. But then a problem began to arise, because Newman insisted on truth, and as he was later to say, to become deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. So as he was studying the early church councils, he just celebrated his 1750th anniversary of Nicaea last year in Rome. The Nicaea is where Jesus is confirmed as divine in the person of the Trinity. As Newman began to study the early church, he realized that the whole thrust of it was what we would call Catholic. And so the work he had to do in England that Amy was talking about was when he got back, he began to recover what we would call the Catholic elements in the Anglican Church, many of which had kind of drifted away over the years. And it was very strange because he thought he was coming back to fortify the Anglicans, and in fact what he did is ended up becoming a celebrated Catholic convert. But I don't think that this is unusual. One of his other phrases that he uses in different places is holiness before peace. It's a phrase I constantly turn over in my mind because, of course, what we like to do is we would prefer to be peaceful, but holiness doesn't always allow us just to be what we would like to be. There's a way in which holiness calls us out of ourselves and can sometimes take us into some very uncomfortable places. And I've been mentioning these specific phrases, and I'm going to mention some more, and I'd like you to go back to those, because Newman is all of a piece. When he makes one of these compressed statements, you can tell that it really comes from the depths of him. It took him a long time to convert, and you could regard this as his kind of dilly-dallying and not really wanting to make this big step, because he would have to leave his position in Oxford. He lost many friends along the way. Some of his family shunned him. He lost his living. But he wanted to make sure that he had it right. He wasn't just going to go on feelings that happened to be passing by. He really wanted to think it through, pray on it, and let it sink into it. Now, in addition to all this kind of intellectual work, we just heard that beautiful hymn. I was going to read it to you, but we actually heard it sung, so it's unnecessary for me to do this. It's also good to know that Newman was a poet. He's got a collection of poems. It's probably about 300 pages of poems, many of them really well worth reading. He did two novels, one called Callista, which is about persecution in the 3rd century, I think the Diocletian persecution, and it's set in North Africa. And he also did a novel called Lost and Gained, which is about a young man who converts in Oxford. And these are actually, Callista has a place in my heart because I think it's a really heartfelt novel, the way that he put it together. He also very famously did The Dream of Gerontius, which is about an old man who's dying. It's put to music by Sir Edward Elgar, a very beautiful kind of oratorial piece. So there's a lot to him. There's a lot to him over and above just the things that we're familiar with in terms of his theology and his ecclesial history. It took about a decade for Newman to make the big turn, but he realized where the truth was and where he thought that that third of his major principles, remember he said we need truth, we need a church to confirm us in the truth. He finally realized that what he objected to, the things that he saw in Sicily and in Rome that he objected to, were not so much corruptions as they were kind of exaggerated practices. He didn't like everything he saw in the Catholic Church in Italy, of course, but he was both repelled and he was attracted, and I think there was a seed there just because of his work. Just a side note, when Newman became a Catholic finally, and he moved out of Oxford, he helped form the Oratory, the Oratorians in Birmingham, and the Oratorians were largely devoted to education back in those days, and they founded a school in Birmingham, who had as one of its star students none other than Hilaire Belloc. And also among the Oratorians, there were two brothers whose mother died, his father had already died, but when they arrived, their mother got close to the Oratorians, and she died. And so the Oratorians brought up these two brothers, one of whom is J.A.R. Tolkien. So that influence of Newman in literary terms, in cultural terms, as well as theology and ecclesiology, is quite important. Now, I want to situate Newman a little bit, and maybe Edward will have some other things to add into this. Look, there are two, I often, when I teach philosophy, like to say that there are two large currents of thought in Catholicism. One is the one that a lot of us are very familiar with. It's sort of the Thomistic Aristotelian tradition, where you have very tight logical definitions, and they're built up and up into an entire system. Right? And so there's a place for that, and it's a very important place. It's curious that when Newman was studying in Rome, St. Thomas was not very much in favor in the Catholic Church in those days. I write about this in my book, A Deeper Vision. But it took Leo XIII to call for a renewal of the study of St. Thomas. And in the meantime, here's Newman thinking he's going to study St. Thomas, and he goes to Rome, and everybody's saying, I know, we don't read it. But that's certainly one of the strong parts of our Catholic tradition. It goes all the way back to Aristotle and through Thomas. The other large current that I think helps us to situate Newman is what I would call the Platonic Augustinian tradition. And this is a more personalist approach. If you read Augustine, he arrives at all kinds of amazing truths, but it's not exactly kind of logical progression that you go through with Augustine. If you read the Confessions, right, there's a very passionate person out seeking the truth who's very troubled. You know, that famous passage at the beginning of Confessions, Lord, you made us for yourself, and unquiet is our heart until it rests in you. And I think that Newman is somewhat in that tradition that goes back to Plato and to Augustine in the most obvious ways, where there's a conversation with this. You know, there are dialogues that Plato writes, and they aren't dialogues like dialogues are in the church in Rome under synodality these days. They're real dialogues. The dialogues where people are trying to get actually to the truth. And you see that in Augustine, and I think you see it eminently also in Newman. One other thing I can't help but quote, because I love Newman's writing so much. And as a writer, of course, you have one eye on the substance and another eye on the way that it's presented, because you know that if you don't present things properly, even some of the most beautiful things you know aren't communicated to people. James Joyce. No less than James Joyce, who was a fairly good judge of style and knew how to write, said this about Newman. Nobody has ever written English prose that can be compared with that of a tiresome footling little Anglican parson who afterwards became a prince of the only true church. Well said, James Joyce. Now, we don't have time to go through some of the big books. I encourage you to read the Apologia. You certainly want to read an essay on the development of doctrine, which I'm going to talk about toward the end, and his essay on the grammar of assent, but an idea of the university, obviously. But I want to take a lesser work that might give us an idea, a deeper, a fuller idea of what Newman means when he says he's talking about the heart. There's a collection of some of his writings, which is called the Tamworth Reading Room. Now, Newman got involved in a dispute with Sir Robert Peel, who was a kind of an eminent person in his day. Newman was already a Catholic by this point. And Peel put out what was kind of a very familiar view of what a broader human life is like for us today, in that he said what we need are scientific studies that help us on the technical side, and then we study the humanities on the more humanistic side. A lot of people think that today. They think that technical knowledge in government schools are all we need to form flourishing citizens. Right? Science on the rationalist side, literature on the humanities side. Newman thought that this was absolutely wrong. He denounced it, I'm quoting him here, the view that first comes knowledge, then reasoning, and then belief. This is why science has so little of a religious tendency, because deductions have no power of persuasion. Now, what he means by this is not that science, math, the hard rationalistic disciplines are not important. What he's saying is that in their own way, They are important, but if we expect them to form individual persons in the deepest way, if we expect them to form societies, then we're setting out on the wrong foot to begin with. Here's what he continues. You know, science, technology produce good things, but we also don't seem to produce bad things. Here's what he said is the most important. Deductions have no power of persuasion. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion. Now, if you've been lucky in your life, maybe you've had one person or more than one person. It could be a parent, could be a coach, could be a pastor. If you're very lucky, it could have been a professor at Thomas More College, whose influence you deeply, who's made your life different than what it would have been otherwise. When he talks about no man will be a martyr for a conclusion, a martyr, as I know from having studied this, is someone who's willing to stake his or her very life on a truth, on something that they're absolutely committed to. This is the power that converted the Roman Empire. People were willing to die for Christianity in those days. The arguments and the analyses come after that, but it's truth. It's that truth that speaks to the heart where these things begin. Newman continues in that Tamworth reading in these lines, that no one will be a martyr for a mere experience either. No one, I say, will die for his own calculations. He dies for realities. This is why a literary religion is so little to be depended on. It looks well in fair weather, but its doctrines are opinions. And when called to suffer for them, it slips between its folios or burns them at its heart. Now, Newman doesn't use a lot of technical terms, but here's a pair of terms that I think will be helpful to understand what he's getting at here. He talks about what he calls notional assent and real assent. So if you go to the Catechism, or you go to St. Thomas, or you go to any number of texts, you can learn the ideas that are there, right? And that's what he calls notionalism. You read the truths of the Catechism and you say, yeah, okay, that's true. But the real assent is what takes place in the human heart, where that stuff is applied and begins to change you internally. And not only internally, it changes the way you think, the way you act, the way you feel about things, and the way that you operate in the world as well. And I think that this is where he shows great human penetration into who we are, as well as great intellectual conception of what we are. You know, we talk in English about taking something to heart. If you memorize a poem by heart, it becomes a part of you and stays with you in a way that just an idea doesn't really. So real assent of things means to make them a part of you. And the true faith that all of us should be practicing or aspiring to practice is precisely that. Here's what he says about logically, that the logical religion will be no religion at all. I'm quoting. Life is not long enough for a religion of inferences. We shall never have done beginning if we determine to begin with a proof. In all ages of the world, no religion has yet been a religion of physics, of philosophy, or philosophy. It has ever been synonymous with revelation. It never has been a deduction from what we know. It has ever been an assertion of what we are to believe. It has never lived in conclusion. It has a message or a history or a vision. Newman also warns about something that I take very much to heart. It's amazing to think of him in the 1800s worrying about this, but he says that not only is opinion begun to take over religion, so is journalism. Now, if you're in my line of work where you're expected to have an opinion about everything, it's something that if you don't take it to heart, you will probably shipwreck at some point. We simply can't know everything. And if we pay attention to the winds and the various currents of journalism, we get blown around without any actual anchoring in any one given place. So I think that, again, this is one of the places where he's a brilliant thinker, but he's also so sympathetic to what is happening in the world that it just astonishes you that he was able to do this in his time. Now, knowledge, of course, helps anchor us in some ways, because it takes away some confusions that we might have. But here's where he comes down in the idea of the university about what the role of knowledge is. Right? And he believes that universities should teach knowledge. They should not be research places. They should teach knowledge, because teaching is one thing and research is another. And he says we need proper teaching of various disciplines. Here's what he says. Today, we might be tempted to think, he talks about the wild living intellect of man, which is not a term of praise in his estimation, that the mind is all over the place, the emotions are all over the place, and we all experience this, right? I mean, you have to discipline yourself if you're going to achieve anything. Here's what he says, though, about how we need to regard knowledge in relation to what we know to be in our souls. I'm quoting. Quarry the granite rocks with razors, or moor the vessel with a thread of silk. Then may you hope with such keen and delicate instruments as human knowledge and human reason to overcome those giants, the passion and the pride of man. Now, this may sound like Newman is talking about irrationality or an irrational attachment to persons, rather than following the truth. But the example I often use when I teach this passage in Newman is to think about Kant. Kant died in the same year that Newman was born, 1801, by the way. And what did Kant try to do? Kant said he wanted to develop a system of rational ethics that could be followed et si Deus non daretur, even if God does not exist. Pope Benedict XVI, looking back at the history of the West since Kant in 1801, says, well, it's an idea, but look, we see what's happened over the last 2 centuries. Maybe it would be good for us to behave as if God existed, whether we believe in him or not. And there's a reason for this. If you think about this, you can have a perfectly logical, rational, Kantian ethical system, right? It'll all be consistent, it can be very perspicacious, etc. But why would anybody want to follow it? Just because it's rational? To want to follow something has to come from inside of you. You have to desire to do the right thing. And to desire to do the right thing is on a different plane than just working out a rational system. And especially, as we know, when what are the things that tempt us? Sex, power, fame, all sorts of human motivations. To want to do what is true, to want to do what is right, we have to love those things. And this is where Newman is, I think, extremely helpful. That if we don't have a love of truth and regard truth as the basis of our lives, then we're going to be blown about in the wind. I think that this is a place where Newman crosses paths with Augustine. Augustine says in there's a famous passage in the Confessions, it's in book 13, the passage that I quoted before about our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Everyone knows that because it's in the first pages or so of book 1. Here's where Augustine ends up at the end in book 13 of the Confession. Speaking to God. In your good pleasure lies our peace. The body by its own weight gravitates toward its own place. Weight goes downward, but to its own place. Fire tends upwards, a stone downwards. They are propelled by their own weights. They seek their own places. Oil poured under the water is raised above the water. Water poured out upon oil sinks under the oil. They are propelled by their own weights. They seek their own places. Out of order, they are restless. Restored to order, they are at rest. My weight is my love. By it I am born, wherever I am born. Pondus meum amor meus. The things that we love are the things that move us in the world. course, we love all sorts of things, but to get those things right, we need guidance. I've been telling people that I think one of the dumbest things that has come out in modern society is this LGBT phrase, love is love. You know, people love all sorts of things, all sorts of things that they shouldn't. Even within normal heterosexual life, people fall in love with the wrong people, they marry the wrong people, they divorce the wrong people. Love is a great thing, but love itself has to be ordered, and this is the place where faith and reason and the heart actually have to come together into a kind of a coalescence that preserves the truth. And this raises the question of conscience, right? Because a friend of mine used to say about politicians in Washington, it's funny how many politicians tell you they're wrestling with their conscience about some issue, and how often they win. It's a joke, but it's human. It's actually the human thing, and all of us have to wrestle with this. One of the things that I think Newman has left to the church that is extremely valuable, in addition to the things I've been talking about, is the idea of development. Right? Development has to take place in each of us as it takes place in the church. One of the reasons why he became a Catholic is he overcame this false idea, this false Protestant idea, that the purity and fullness of the faith was at the beginning. And so we should all go back to whatever the apostles were doing, using clay cups and whatever people think now is the earliest form of the church. And Newman says no. That actually what happens is a living seed is planted when Jesus comes to earth. And we should expect that seed to develop and grow, just as we should expect our own faith, our hearts, to expand into the places where God intends us to become. I mean, we're not the same people we were as children when we're fully adult. And so development is an important part of the human person. But one of the greatnesses of Newman, and I can't go into this too much right now, but if you want to look at the end of his book, an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, he has what he calls seven marks of faithful development. Development is a true, it's a true continuation of what was the deposit of the faith. What he calls a corruption means a departure from the faith. And unfortunately, we see a lot of what he technically calls corruptions even inside the church. But a faithful development is something entirely different. We don't expect a baby to be able to do some things that a full-grown man or woman is able to do. But there is a preservation. There is a continuation of identity all the way along. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the debates in our synodal church these days about whether Vatican II was a rupture with what came before, or whether it was a continuity. There are some progressives in the church who talk about a hermeneutic of rupture. Pope Benedict XVI talked about a hermeneutic of continuity, because a church like ours, a church which was founded by Jesus Christ and continues to grow over time, I don't see how you can possibly speak about rupture. I think you can only talk about good and bad developments, and over time, the church may move in one direction or another, but over time it has to remain faithful to that initial positive faith that Jesus himself left to us. So he puts forward 7 marks of proper development. I'm just going to go through these very fast, but I encourage you, because this is a contemporary issue in the church about continuity. How do we discern what is a real development? It cannot be a reversal. One of the very first one is the preservation of type, and the preservation of type means just as a child is born with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head and a torso, the adult is going to be the same thing. It's a preservation of type. Continuity of principles, he talks about. Power of assimilation. Newman is so brilliant, having read into the history of the church. Power of assimilation means as you go along in time, obviously new things are going to appear, new knowledge, new situations, and a living faith is going to be able to take those in just the way a living plant is able to draw sustenance from whatever weather is happening, from the soil, whatever changes are there. So there's an assimilation where life continues. There's logical sequence. There's what he calls anticipation of the future. So when you look back at the church and you see something like Nicaea, you know, we all just celebrated Nicaea, and you see that the definition of Jesus as true God and true man incarnate on earth, when you look at the Anglican Church of your time, and it doesn't merely believe any of that, something has gone wrong. There's no anticipation of the future. There's no conservative action on the past. And finally, and I think this is really important, finally he says that there's chronic vigor. That fads come and go, even in the church. Fads come and go in Rome as much as they do in Nashville, New Hampshire. But the chronic vigor of the church is that it has its dynamism, it survives from one age to an age to another. There are many times when it looks like the church is done. Back in the 18th century, probably people thought it was just a matter of time before Catholicism faded away. And then we had great figures come along, great saints in the 19th century. John Henry Newman himself, Leo XIII, John Paul II. So let me just conclude. I'm at the end of my time. I want to go back and look at that phrase that I mentioned early on. Ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, from shadows and images into truth. This is the phrase that Newman had inscribed on his tomb. Now, I think in the Catholic tradition there are two ways to read this. The more normal way is kind of an ascetical way. It's to say that as we remove ourselves from the partially true things we see in the world, the images, the shadows, there's a kind of abandonment of that and an opening out to the fullness of God's truth. What Newman saw at 15 years old, when he said that he had that first conversion, he began to almost realize that this world that we're in is a veil beyond which there are the real things, the real truths, the realities. That's one way to read it. And there are all kinds of great mystical treatises. I like myself The Cloud of Unknown by Julian of Norwich. If you're looking for a quick way into it and an easy way to follow it, and that's one way. There's a second way. I've been talking with friends of mine who read Newman, and from images and shadows into truth. Now, another way to do this is what's called the affirmative way. Charles Williams, the literary figure in 20th century England, friend of Tolkien and Lewis, used to talk about the affirmative way, the affirmation of images, whereby when we really pay attention to images in the world, when we really pay attention to those shadowy things that kind of emerge from us, and we understand their limits and what they aren't the eternal realities that lie behind them, but when we understand what they are, we begin to recognize what the creation is and what the creation is not. And so there's a second way to read that phrase of Newman's, and I think both are equally valid and the path worth following. So, let me conclude. Everything in Newman's life keeps our attention, keeps moving us along on the destiny that we've been made for. And his writing itself stays focused on that goal, which of course is easier to say than to live. I mean, you can read Newman. To live what Newman says is a difficult task. Heart speaks to heart. I think Newman speaks to each of us. And the understanding that heart speaks to heart is not just consolation and not just warm feelings, but it's that lived life where there is heart sometimes clashing with heart too. I mean, that's a good thing. It helps move us along. But that's the exciting goal, the exciting drama of being a human being. And it's one, thanks to Newman, that we can see with such luminous clarity. He's a remarkable writer, a remarkable thinker, that we can always remain confident in that vision that no political or cultural disappointment can take away. No personal sin or tragedy can take away. Nothing can take away from us. It's a heartfelt message that Newman has, in which he speaks from his heart to our hearts. And that's why he's the newest doctor in the church. Thank you.
Good evening. I would like to begin by thanking Amy and the college for inviting me. This is a very special treat for me to be addressing so many on John Henry Newman. I've written a lot of books on Newman, and there's nothing I like better than sharing my genuine love for this extraordinary saint. The topic of my paper this evening is St. Thomas Aquinas and St. John Henry Newman, a study in affinity. Speaking of the angelic doctor, Flannery O'Connor once told a correspondent who had asked her opinion of the great saint, "I couldn't make any judgment on the Summa except to say this. I read it for about 20 minutes every night before I go to bed. If my mother were to come in during this process and say, 'Turn off the light, it's late,' I, with lifted finger and broad, bland, beatific expression, would say, on the contrary, I answer that the light, being external and lividness, cannot be turned off. But your eyes." In the same letter, O'Connor also confessed, quote, "I can personally guarantee that St. Thomas loved God, because for the life of me, I cannot help loving St. Thomas." As I shall show in my talk this evening, neither could Newman. In declaring St. Thomas Aquinas and St. John Henry Newman co-patrons of education, Pope Leo XIV has done the Church a welcome service. In this brief talk, I shall discuss their incidental differences and striking similarities to reaffirm their affinity, particularly with regard to what they agreed should be the proper purpose of education. Again and again, in their different but similar ways, they upheld the Church's principle of faith and reason. In intellectual circumstances in which those principles were being corrupted or abandoned altogether. And we can certainly learn from and be fortified by their gallant, brilliant witness. Newman's references to Aquinas in his letters are brief but telling. Who so large and so minute and so exact in thought? Then again, in his philosophical notebook, he had occasion to admit that I do not know enough of him to speak at all, quote unquote. A typical piece of humility in a saint and scholar who always urged that we know truly whatever it is that we claim to know. But having read that sentence, you will understand the diffidence with which I give my talk this evening. If dear John Henry Newman didn't feel as though he had read enough St. Thomas to hold forth on the angelic doctor seriously, what chance is there that I will be able to do that? But I will give it the old college try this evening. As it was, Newman may not have read Aquinas in any methodical way, but he certainly knew a good deal of his essence, so much of which resembled his own. Of course, Newman had wished to read St. Thomas in Rome after his conversion. He had even sought out instruction for this purpose. But Aquinas was not paid much mind in the Roman schools of theology at the time, and in any case, the Dominicans were too busy defending St. Thomas's opposition to the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Then again, as Mariel Trevor says in her biography of Newman, when Newman came to Rome, he was surprised to find that theology was taught to a system of bits and pieces from second-rate manuals. Excuse me. Not only was St. Augustine unknown, but even St. Thomas Aquinas, excuse me, my voice is going. This was partly due to the far-reaching effects of the French Revolution, but also to the fact that the wars after the closed the great schools in France. Newman's library, if you go to Edgbaston outside of Birmingham, is full of wonderful books. Most of those books were bought for a song in London booksellers as a result of the closing of these French schools. Thus, even in 1845, Catholic intellectual studies were at a low ebb, and just in the period when the secular world was in a fervent of scientific discovery, political revolution, and criticism of the fundamentals of religion. What Trevor omits to mention here is that although the French Revolution did have an unfortunate impact on the Dominicans in Rome, their response to the revolution in France, led by the Dominican convert Lacordaire, together with Alexander Jondel and Hyacinthe Cormier, rehabilitated the great tradition of faith and reason at the heart of Thomism, which Newman, in his own way, would also bring to England. One of the major themes of the final volume of my trilogy on Newman and his critics, is the incomprehension, there's no other word for it, the utter incomprehension with which Newman's writings on faith and reason were met by the rationalists of his age. From James Fitzjames Stephen and James Anthony Froude to Frederick Mayrick and Charles Kingsley. 300 years of Anglican Christianity had left the English incapable of appreciating the tradition of faith and reason that St. Thomas had done so much to advance. One of his early parochial and plain sermons, The Self-Wise Inquirer, and this was a very interesting date here, this was written in 1830. Newman pointed out the paradox that when the gift of reason is clear, brilliant, and powerful, then our danger is increased. The first sin of men of superior understanding is to value themselves upon it and look down upon others. They make intellect the measure of praise and blame, and instead of considering a common faith, the bond of union between Christian and Christian, they dream of some other fellowship of civilization, refinement, literature, science, or general mental illumination to unite gifted minds one with another. Having thus cast down moral excellence from its true station and set up the usurping empire of mere reason. What a splendid phrase. The usurping empire of mere reason. Next, they place a value upon all truths exactly in proportion to the possibility of proving them by means of that mere reason. Hence, moral and religious truths are thought little of by them because they fall under the province of conscience, far more than of the intellect. Religion sinks in their estimation or becomes of no account. They begin to think all religions alike, and no wonder, for they are like men who have lost the faculty of discerning colors, and who never by any exercise of reason can make out the difference between white and black. Now that was a sermon that Newman wrote in 1830. If you were to read the speech that Newman gave in 1879 when he was given his red hat, he's saying essentially the same thing. Bob just quoted that passage from the speech that Newman gave at that time. For both Newman and Aquinas, reason was a vital thing, but it had to be tempered by faith. Reason without faith gave rise to manifold moral and intellectual errors. Newman was describing circumstances with lively parallels to those he faced himself when confronted by the infidel rationalism that was bedeviling all Europe before and after he converted. Newman's biographer Wilford Ward was appreciative of this in his Life of the Cardinal, a life in which his hero contended not only with the Scylla and Charybdis of an overwrought ultramontanism on one hand and liberal Catholicism on the other, but what he called the broad bosom of skepticism. Though, as Ward argues, the challenges to the faith with which Aquinas contended were in some respects worse than those Newman confronted. We are rightly anxious in our own day for a Christian and Catholic atmosphere in our own universities, Ward wrote, and so we can sympathize with the distress of the rulers of the church at what they witnessed in Paris in the ages of faith. University professors taught that incarnations of the divinity were many, or that the resurrection of the body and even immortality were incredible, or by a blend of pantheism with positivism, that God was identical with creatures or with the creation, or that Christian theology was based on fables. For Ward, certainly no positions more destructive of Orthodox Christian faith have been upheld in our own day by rationalist critics in England or Germany. The religious skepticism that accompanied the triumph of liberalism in the Oxford of mid-century, when, according to Mark Pattison, men questioned everything and were impatient to throw the whole cargo of tradition overboard, was no whit greater than that which characterized the Paris of the early 13th century, and it was less openly avowed. There was, however, this difference, that the educated classes in the Middle Ages bore a far smaller proportion to the whole population, and the danger was consequently less universal. Theodore de Rimpel, a writer with whose works I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar, is a British writer, has shown how the ideas of the left liberal university have trickled down to society as a whole, with the most malign consequences imaginable, to corrupt and degrade our moral, educational, and cultural life. As a result, everywhere we turn, we can see how deterministic victimhood has supplanted norms of personal responsibility. To give just one example, certainly Newman saw clearly enough how the bad ideas of intellectuals and public men were vitiating his society. In his Beato speech that he gave in 1879 when he was given his red hat, he is marvelously prophetic about this. He says, "Hitherto, the civil power has been Christian, even in countries separated from the church, as in my own, the dictum was in force, that Christianity was the law of the land. Now everywhere, that goodly framework of society, which is the creation of Christianity, is throwing off Christianity. The dictum with 100 others which followed upon it is gone or is going everywhere, and by the end of the century, unless the Almighty interferes, it will be forgotten. Hitherto it has been considered that religion alone, with its supernatural sanctions, was strong enough to secure submission of the masses of our population to law and order. Now the philosophers and politicians are bent on satisfying this problem without the aid of Christianity." In asking himself how this ruinous state of affairs had come about, Newman could not have been more foursquare. The bad idea responsible for unraveling the very fabric of society was something, as he said, he opposed for 30, 40, 50 years, and his definition of it is as applicable to our world as it was to Newman's own in the 19th century. We have to remember that Newman lives throughout the whole 19th century. This is the fellow who was born in 1801 and dies in 1890. So he sees, being born as he was in the shadow of the French Revolution, liberalism wreak absolute havoc in the Europe of his day. Liberalism in religion, he writes, is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another. And this is the teaching which is gaining substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of any religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are matters of opinion. We could have encountered this in the New York Times this week. I mean, that's how relevant this critique of the effects of liberalism is. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous. And it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy. Since then, religion is so personal a peculiarity and so private a possession, we must of necessity ignore it in the intercourse of man with man. If a man puts on a new religion every morning, what is that to you? It is as impertinent to think about a man's religion as about his sources of income or his management of his family. Religion is in no sense the bond of society, quote unquote. St. Thomas, in contending against the misinterpretations of Aristotle, which pose so fundamental a threat to the integrity of the university, let alone the coherence of Catholic theology, can be seen to have been the genuine trailblazer for the cause of truth, on whose authority Newman relied for his own understanding of the clash between truth and error. Newman says this as much explicitly. Frederick II established a university at Naples with a view to the propagation of the infidelity which was so dear to him. Newman writes in The Idea of a University. It gave birth to the great St. Thomas, says Newman, the champion of revealed truth. So intimate was the intermixture, so close the grapple between faith and unbelief. It was the conspiracy of traders, it was a civil strife of which the medieval seats of learning were the scene. In this day, on the contrary, truth and error lie over against each other with a valley between them. And David goes forward to the sight, in the sight of all men, from his own camp to engage with the Philistines. Such is the providential overruling of that principle of toleration. That principle of toleration is another genuine bugbear in Newman's thinking, which was conceived in the spirit of unbelief in order to effect the destruction of Catholicity. The sway of the church is contracted, Newman concedes, but she gains an intensity that she loses in extent. She has now, and he's saying this in 1873, a direct command and a reliable influence over her own institutions, which was wanting in the Middle Ages. A university is her possession in these times, as well as her creation, nor has she the need, which was once so urgent, to expel heresies from her pale, which have now their own centers of attraction elsewhere. Quote unquote. When we read this passage in which Newman is so grateful to the Catholic University, however contracted, for remaining true to its Catholic mission, we can only deplore the folly that led Father Theodore Hesburgh's Land O'Lakes agreement to secularize so many of what had been our wonderfully Catholic universities. A secularization which has recently culminated in Notre Dame, naming the pro-abortion, pro-population control Susan Osterman to head up its Asian Institute. I'm sure we're all familiar with that miserable appointment. Tragically, no one took Hesburgh aside and explained to him how calamitous it would be for the Catholic University in America to accede to the principle of toleration, conceived in the spirit of unbelief, the greatest advocate of which was, of course, the blasphemous Voltaire. In light of this appointment, Newman's paean to Aquinas takes on renewed force. In lively contrast, Aquinas composed his Summa Theologiae under obedience. I spoke to a couple of Dominican friends of mine before I put together this talk, and they, to a man, emphasized this very notion of obedience, that Aquinas wrote the Summa Theologica as a result of his order telling him they wanted a theological book for beginners. So he wrote this under obedience expressly to instruct his fellow Dominicans in the realities of the human soul, an incomparable work of Catholic education which prospered not only Dominican pulpits, confessionals, and houses of study, but those of all Christendom. When the misinterpretations of Aristotle rose, many in the church were content simply to ignore or prescribe the new learning. Aquinas sensibly decided to engage it with all its incidental errors in order to establish what could and what could not be reconciled to the depositum fidei. And thus he helped to advance the church's understanding of faith and reason when it was needed most. As Christopher Dawson says in The Formation of Christendom, the great task of 13th century scholasticism was to subject the whole body of new knowledge to searching and systematic, to a searching and systematic process of criticism, so as to rethink Aristotle in Christian terms. Newman puts this readiness on the part of the church and her schoolmen to enter into the claims of the new learning in context when he writes, "Now at length we may ask with curious interest, did the church alter her ancient rule of action and prescribe intellectual activity? Just the contrary. This is the very age of universities. It is the classical period of the schoolmen. It is the splendid and palmary instance of the wise policy and large liberality of the church as regards philosophical inquiry. If there ever was a time when the intellect went wild and had a licentious revel, it was at the date I speak of. When was there ever a more curious, more meddling, bolder, keener, more penetrating, more rationalistic exercise of the reason than at that time? What class of questions did the subtle metaphysical spirits not scrutinize? What premise, was allowed without examination? What principle was not traced to its first origin and exhibited in its most naked shape? What whole was not analyzed? Did the church take a high hand with philosophy then? No, not though that philosophy was metaphysical. It was a time when she had temporal power and could have exterminated the spirit of iniquity with fire and sword. But she determined to put it down by argument. And Newman, of course, italicizes that word, argument. Of course, this was altogether in keeping, as Newman saw it, with the liberty requisite for Catholics to do battle against the forces of intellectual and moral error. So here we have to contrast this understanding of proper liberty with the travesty of liberty that, of course, we see in liberalism. For Newman, it is a matter of primary importance in the cultivation of those sciences in which truth is discoverable by human intellect that the investigator should be free, independent, unshackled, that he should be allowed and enabled without impediment to fix his mind intently, nay, exclusively, on his special object, without the risk of being distracted every other minute in the process and progress of his inquiry by charges of temerariousness or by warnings against extravagance or scandal. Newman, some of you may know, got into trouble with certain how shall I say, busybodies in the Vatican, and I believe it's to those unfortunate episodes to which he's referring there. In another passage from the Idea of the University, Newman shows not only that he was clearly aware of St. Thomas's contribution to the schoolmen's great work of criticism, but that this work is at the heart of the communication of knowledge, as he called it, and the concomitant enlargement or enlightenment central to proper education. There is no enlargement, Newman says, unless there be comparison of ideas one with another, as they come before the mind, and a systematizing of them. We feel our minds to be growing and expanding then when we not only learn but refer what we learn to what we know already. It is not the mere addition of our knowledge that is the illumination, but the movement onwards of that mental center to which both what we know and what we are learning gravitates. Again, whenever Newman is explaining these processes with which we actually do the the thinking that we do. There's an amazing, wonderful, welcome precision, a practical precision with which he describes these things. It's never theoretical, it's always practical. How do we actually acquire the enlargement essential to education? And therefore, truly great intellect, and recognized to be such by the common opinion of mankind, such as the intellect of Aristotle, or of St. Thomas, or of Newton, or of Goethe. I purposely take instances within and without the Catholic pale when I would speak of the intellect as such, is one which takes a connected view of old and new, past and present, far and near, and which has an insight into the influence of all these one on another, without which there is no whole and no center. And one can see a kind of echo of that in Eliot's great essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, in which he describes how the introduction of the genuinely original new work of art transforms the older works of art. The very fact that Newman drew on so many of Aquinas' insights proves how well he could connect the old and new. For example, he followed Aquinas in upholding the imperative sovereignty of conscience, though always with the proviso that it be formed in accordance with the magisterial truths of the faith. He also followed Aquinas in recognizing the profound nobility of action. Again, Newman is always the man of action. There's a practicality about Newman. He's not a theorist, nor is he in a way sort of an intellectual, as the French would understand that term. He's someone who thinks a great deal, but it's always, as it is with Aquinas, it's always thought that is trained on proper action. The purpose of thought is to guide our actions. For Aquinas, this is one of the best passages, I have to say, that I've encountered in reading Aquinas. It's really a brilliant passage. He says here, intelligent creatures take part in providence by their own providing for themselves and others. Thus they join in and make their own the eternal reason through which they have their natural aptitude for their due activity and purpose. In other words, for Aquinas, we have a kind of co-creative role to play in providence itself. I mean, when one takes that in, that's a very profound observation. And this was something that deeply, deeply resonated with John Henry Newman. For Newman, premises imply conclusions, germs lead to developments, principles have issues, doctrines lead to actions. One can also see this respect for action in Newman's insisting on the utility of education. Not something oftentimes people lose sight of that. You know, there are passages in Newman's idea of a university in which he says mental cultivation should be sought for itself. But that certainly never meant that we should be educating the young to be useless. The whole purpose of education is to make these young men and women useful. Yes, he regarded general culture of mind as a good in itself, but he never thought that education trained on such cultures should somehow be useless. As health ought to precede labor of the body, and as a man in health can do what an unhealthy man cannot do, and as of this health the properties of strength, energy, agility, graceful carriage, and action, manual dexterity, and endurance of fatigue, so in like manner, general culture of mind is the best aid to professional and scientific study. And educated men can do what illiterate cannot. And the man who has learned to think and to reason and to compare and to discriminate and to analyze, who has refined his taste and formed his judgment and sharpened his mental vision, will not indeed at once be a lawyer or a pleader or an orator or a statesman or a physician or a good landlord or a man of business or a soldier or an engineer or a chemist or a geologist or an antiquarian, but he will be placed in that state of intellect in which he can take up any one of the sciences or callings I have referred to, or any other for which he has a taste or special talent, with an ease, a grace, a versatility, and a success to which another is a stranger. In this sense, then, mental culture is emphatically useful, italicized. As for St. Thomas's readiness to enter into the work of Aristotle, it's important to remember that he was not alone in seeking to reconcile the work of the Greek philosopher with the teachings of the Church. As Ward points out in an essay on St. Thomas and medieval thought, an Englishman, Alexander of Hales, the first friar to teach in the University of Paris, was a pioneer in this movement of reconciliation. He was acquainted with the whole of the works of Aristotle, and he adopted in his lectures the dialectical form and the statement of arguments pro and con for each proposition. Of course, this is also the method that Aquinas will pursue as well. This was to abandon the old rhetorical exposition of earlier days. Albertus Magnus, the master of St. Thomas, took a similar line and was the first scholastic to introduce Aristotle's philosophy into theology. In spite of strong opposition, this plan of action did eventually stem in Paris the tide of ultra-rationalism and license of thought, which mere repression had been unable to arrest. Frederick Copleston, the Jesuit historian of philosophy, was perceptive on the papal encyclical, often misconstrued as part of this repression. When Pope Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris asserted the permanent value of the Thomist synthesis and urged Catholic philosophers to draw their inspiration from Aquinas while developing Thomism to meet modern intellectual needs, he was not asking them to discard all thought after the 13th century. As Copleston says, Leo wished to renew, not to stop philosophical inquiry, to give it a fresh impetus. And certainly there was a renewal of Catholic thought that coincided with the renewal of Thomism, as Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, Christopher Dawson, and Alistair MacIntyre certainly prove. That Newman reveled in Leo's encyclical is clear from the letter he wrote the pontiff just 4 months after Aeterni Patris appeared. And this is Newman's response to the Pope. He wrote this letter directly to Leo. All good Catholics must feel it a first necessity that the intellectual exercise without which the Church cannot fulfill her supernatural mission duly should be founded upon broad as well as true principles, that the mental creations of her theologians, of her controversialists, and pastors should be grafted on the Catholic tradition of philosophy, and should not start from the novel and simply original tradition, which should be substantially one with the teaching of St. Athanasius, St. Augustine, St. Anselm, and St. Thomas, as those great doctors in turn are one with each other. And of course, it's very moving for us to read that letter in the 33-volume Letters and Diaries, because of course, John Henry Newman is now one with those doctors whom he revered so deeply. At a time when there is so much cultivation of mind, Newman says, so much intellectual excitement, so many new true and so many new views, true and false, and so much temptation to overstep the old truth, we need just what your holiness has supplied us in your recent pastoral. Here where Newman says that the work of theologians and controversialists must be grafted on the Catholic tradition of philosophy, not on the vagaries of novelty. And boy, have we ever been subjected to the vagaries of novelty in recent years. He is describing his own work, especially its deep indebtedness to Scripture, the Fathers, and tradition, We should also remind ourselves that Pace, what some commentators have claimed, Newman's work on doctrinal development, which he nicely defined as, quote, the process by which, under the magisterium of the church, implicit faith becomes explicit. It's almost a kind of Thomistic brevity, Thomistic succinctness to that phrase, which he was well received by the neo-scholastics in Rome in the late 19th century. Like Giovanni Perrone, professor and later rector of the Roman College, they regarded it as perfectly consonant with Thomist teaching. After the Achille trial, Perrone even referred to Newman not only as a light and pillar of the church, but a martyr. Though it is striking that while Newman approved of Perrone's theology, he deprecated his polemics. Why? For Newman, Perrone, quote, did not understand the arguments he has to deal with, a telling criticism from so astute a controversialist as the English convert. When it came to exposing the fallacies of intellectual error, so crucial to proper Catholic education, Newman's only rival was Aquinas. What we'll notice in the two saints is their approach to language, though even here their differences shed light on their similarities. Whether one reads his text in their original Latin or English translation, St. Thomas writes an austere prose, free of ornament or rhetorical flourish. Its hallmarks are precision and elegance, as this passage shows from his commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences. According to Aristotle, goals play the same role in desire as premises in understanding, because the first and highest of any particular sort of thing causes the rest. Knowledge of premises and contemplative thinking causes knowledge of everything else. Desire of a goal causes desire of everything leading to the goal. So, since bliss is the goal of human life, whatever it is our will's desire to do is ordered to bliss. And we see this in experience. When people desire things because they think them good, and when they possess things they think good, they reckon themselves that much closer to bliss, since good added to good comes closer to the perfect good, which is bliss itself. So every desire is ordered to bliss, quote unquote. Here there is not only pellucidity, but succinctness. John Henry Newman, on the other hand, tends to be more expansive, more unbuttoned, more rhetorical. In fact, Newman's rhetoric is always an emblem of his sincerity and conviction. If you really want to read Newman when he is most convinced of any given proposition or argument or what have you, this is when you see the fireworks of his rhetoric at their best, which is really tends not to be the case with most stylists. It's when the arguments are conking out, or when the point of view is at its weakest, that a lot of stylists lay on the rhetoric. This is not the case with Newman. It is a mark, I have to say, of how poor our educational institutions have become, Catholic and non-Catholic alike, that so many presumably educated readers complain of what they regard as the difficulty of Newman's English. It is true that as a stylist he has many different registers depending upon the occasion. He can be eulogistic, expository, declamatory, hortatory, or satirical, but he is always readable. Don't allow anyone to give you any impression otherwise. As Bob said, you should start with the sermons. The sermons are absolutely marvelous. And I will give you an example of one of the sermons. This is the beginning of a sermon that he wrote in 1849 after he converted. It's called God's Will, the End of Life. A very Thomistic title indeed. This is supremely readable. I mean, listen to this. I'm going to ask you a question, my dear brethren, so trite and therefore so uninteresting, and you may wonder why I put it, and may object that it will be difficult to fix the mind on it, and may anticipate that nothing profitable can be made of it. It is this: why were you sent into the world? After all, it is perhaps a thought more obvious than it is common, more easy than it is familiar. I mean, it ought to come into your minds, but it does not. There are those who recollect the first time when it came home to them. They were but little children, and they were by themselves. And they spontaneously asked themselves, it's beautiful, very charming writing here. Or rather, God spake to them, why am I here? How came I here? Who brought me here? What am I to do? Now, that's, to me, wonderfully readable. In this sermon, we have the beauty of Newman's style and all its refulgence and grace, but also a good example of that style's colloquial character, which struck the poet Jared Manley Hopkins, who said, what Cardinal Newman does is to think aloud, the poet recognized, to think with pen and paper. He seems to be thinking Gibbon is the last great master of traditional English prose. He is its perfection. I do not propose to emulate him. I begin all over again from the language of conversation, the language of common life. When the Eton master Oscar Browning met Newman in the Oratory in 1866, he was struck, as he said, with Newman's marvelous copiousness of language and his abundant fluency. Also with his use of harmless, worldly slang, that he might not appear priggish or monkish. Now, I don't think that was the motivation behind Newman's fondness for slang. He just had a delight in the English language, and he had the good sense to know that oftentimes slang gets the job done better than more conventional English. Regardless of whether we agree with Hopkins that Newman thought Gibbon the last great master of traditional English prose, the poet does here nevertheless make a shrewd point. Certainly, for all his dazzling attainments, Newman paid very close attention indeed to common life. It was an expression of his respect for the importunate claims of reality. Bob translated Newman's epitaph from shadows and imaginations into the truth. Ian Carr, the great definitive biographer of Newman, quotes that Latin passage, I think, exquisitely by saying that it should be translated from unreality to reality, reality with a capital R. Thus, the importunate claims of reality, equality, shared profoundly with Aquinas, because there's a great deal of logic, there's a great deal of reasoning in Aquinas, but he is always trained on the practical, one way or another, whose common sense Chesterton celebrates so exuberantly. If you want to read one book, one rather brief book, brilliant book about St. Thomas Aquinas, Chesterton's is the book, and he can see the great element of common sense in St. Thomas, because of course this was an element that he had as well. Thus the limpidity of Newman's prose is of a piece with the deeply practical cast of his mind and character. Chesterton spoke for both saints when he said, God made man so that he was capable of coming into contact with reality. This is why when Gilson and the other great writers of books about St. Thomas Aquinas and Thomism praised Chesterton so highly, they recognized that he got it, the saint's essence, like no one else. Secular education governed by reason without faith, precisely because it is so thoroughly invested in demonstrable illusion, is something that both Newman and Aquinas argue against. Now, although there is something stylish, even charming in Newman's writing, it also has St. Thomas's clarity. Indeed, Newman once admitted that I think I never have written for writing's sake, but my one and only single desire and aim has been to do what is so difficult, to express clearly and exactly my meaning. Asked about influences on his style, Newman replied, "The only master of style I've ever had is Cicero, where great mastery of Latin is shown especially in its clearness." Now again, there are many registers in Newman's style. The parochial and plain sermons has at times an almost Johnsonian gravity, whereas that of the present position of Catholics is Dickensian, Rolex. But whether he is remonstrating with his readers like the moralists in Johnson or attempting to laugh them out of their folly like Swift or Fielding, he is always intent on precisely the same exactitude that animates so much of Thomas's writing. The only difference is that St. Thomas eschews the various resources of rhetoric. Certainly the stylist in Chesterton recognized the power and appeal of this approach. In his brilliant study of the saint, Chesterton observes how the very dullness of diction, of which some complain, was enormously convincing in St. Thomas. He could have given wit as well as wisdom, but he was so prodigiously in earnest that he gave his wisdom without his wit. Nice Chestertonian paradox there. One striking similarity between St. Thomas and Newman is that they both had barristerial minds. Actually, the word barristerial, interesting enough, if you look at the OED, comes into the language as a result of something that Charles Kingsley, of all people, the man who inspired the Apologia, he was the fellow who came up with that word barristerial. And Newman practices that, as does St. Thomas, again and again and again. They were never convinced of any given conviction or argument without being appreciative of the manifold objections that might be leveled against it. This is why Newman is such a superb apologist. He's anticipating the objections at every step of the way and foiling them, as a good lawyer would in a court of law, making their opponent's argument better than the opponent himself, and then showing how it doesn't hold water. Moreover, they put their opponents' arguments better than the opponents themselves. The relentless logic of St. Thomas's arguments is well known. But what needs stressing is that this logic is fortified at every turn by his patient parrying of objections. If there is a triumph of logic in St. Thomas, it is peculiarly a peculiarly hard-earned triumph. He takes none of his positions for granted, though like Newman, he always starts from the premise that the existence of God and all that his existence entails are not only real, but demonstrably, supremely real. It's exciting to read Aquinas. You feel as though you're on a kind of path of discovery. Credulity, therefore, not any Cartesian doubt, is always their starting point, but they recognize that this is a point of manifold contention by their contemporaries, indeed by the very captiousness of the human intellect. In the case of the claim, for example, that every desire is ordered to bliss, St. Thomas considers objections that may appear plausible but lack tenability. Newman's work also abounds with engagements of specious objections, though he goes St. Thomas one better by actually dramatizing his opponent's reasoning, taking it on as though it were his own in order to show its hollowness or unreality. Two most damning terms in Newman's critical lexicon. In fact, he did this so artfully that many of his detractors would accuse him of actually holding the very skeptical views he wrote to explode. Indeed, as my book on Newman's critics shows, the two commonest charges leveled against poor Newman were skepticism and sophistry. When describing the movements of the church's enemies, Newman often deploys military metaphors. I'm sure English majors here in the room will understand this allusion. In effect, he becomes a kind of rhetorical Uncle Toby. I look out then into the enemy's camp, and I try to trace the outlines of the hostile movements and the preparations for assault, which are there in agitation against us. I often think about the New York Times editorial board when I read this passage. One can readily imagine them engaging in the same kind of military thinking. when they come up with their daily editorial response to the news of the world. The arming and the maneuvering, the earthworks and the mines go on incessantly. One cannot, of course, tell without the gift of prophecy which of his projects will be carried into effect and attain its purpose and which will eventually fail or be abandoned. Nevertheless, Newman could delineate the main lines of the liberal philosophy that sought to undermine and supplant the Catholic tradition of faith and reason. And here again is an absolutely brilliantly prophetic description of the contemporary secular university. You may have opinions in religion, you may have theories, you may have arguments, you may have probabilities. He portrayed his rationalist liberal arguing. You may have anything but demonstration, and therefore you cannot have science. In mechanics, you advance from sure premises to sure conclusions. In optics, you form your undeniable facts into system, arrive at general principles, and then again infallibly apply them. Here you have science. But for the liberal rationalist, it is absurd for men in our present state to teach anything positively about the next world, that there is a heaven or a hell or a last judgment, or that the soul is immortal, or that there is a God. As my book Newman and His Critics shows, Newman in his own day had many detractors masquerading as critics, but he had few genuine critics who could enter into the real purpose of his combat with liberalism and the rationalism and infidelity to which it gives rise. One thinker who could have appreciated Newman's attainments in this line more than anyone would have been St. Thomas Aquinas, precisely because of the truly critical cast of his mind. I often think of these two encountering one another in heaven. That would be quite an encounter. Very, very similar for all their differences. Another vital point of similarity between the two saints is that both managed to convey the personal investment they made in the faith that meant so much to them. Here's Newman's peroration to his sermon, God's Will, the End of Life, the introduction of which I quoted earlier. Yes, Newman was a poet, but even when he was not writing verse, he wrote a poet's prose. And here's a good example. The world goes on from age to age, for the holy angels and blessed saints are always crying, alas, alas, and woe, woe, over the loss of vocations, and the disappointment of hopes, and the scorn of God's love, and the ruin of souls. One generation succeeds another, and whenever they look down upon earth from their golden thrones, they see scarcely anything but a multitude of guardian spirits, downcast and sad, each following his own charge in anxiety, or in terror, or in despair, vainly endeavoring to shield him from the enemy and failing because he will not be shielded. Times come and go, and man will not believe that that is to be which is not yet, or that what now is only continues for a season and is not eternity. The end is the trial, the world passes. It is but a pageant and a scene. The lofty palace crumbles, the busy city is mute, the ships of Tarshish have sped away. On heart and flesh death is coming, the veil is breaking. Departing soul, how hast thou used thy talents, thy opportunities, the light poured around thee, the warnings given thee, the grace inspired into thee? O my Lord and Savior, support me in that hour in the strong arms of thy sacraments, and by the fresh fragrance of thy consolations. Let the absolving words be said over me, and the holy oil sign and seal me, and thy own body be my food, and thy blood my sprinkling, and let my sweet Mother Mary breathe on me, and my angel whisper peace to me, and my glorious saints, and my one own dear Father Philip smile on me, that in them all and through them all I may receive the gift of perseverance, and die as I desire to live, in thy faith, in thy church, in thy service, and in thy love. Here in a prose suffused with personal prayer, there is no dissociation of sensibility, to use Eliot's famous phrase. Newman joins thought and feeling together inextricably. He's not an intellectual. Don't allow anyone to bang on about that. It's false. He knows how to use intellectual argument, but at heart, as Bob was saying, he is someone who resorts to both the head and the heart. As for Aquinas, those who regard him as simply a theological logician, a far-ranging, profound, inspired logician, but a logician and little else, will miss the fact that he too brings to his work the prayer that one might be inclined to imagine would have no place in any logician's calculus. Yet one of his most lovely hymns, translated by Hopkins, reminds us of the similarly deep feeling that suffuses all his thought. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this hymn. It's very, very beautiful. I'm only going to read a couple of stanzas from it, but it's well worth looking at. It's in Hopkins' collected poetry. Godhead here in hiding, whom I do adore, masked by these bare shadows, shape and nothing more. See, Lord, at thy service, lo, lies here a heart, lost, all lost, in wonder at the God thou art. Seeing, touching, tasting, are in thee deceived. How says trusted hearing, that shall be believed. What God's Son has told me, take for truth I do. Truth himself speaks truly, where there's nothing true. On the cross thy Godhead made no sign to men. Here thy very manhood steals from human ken. Both are my confession, both are my belief, and I pray the prayer of the dying thief. As this shows, Aquinas, for all his faith and wisdom, had a deep respect for mystery. And this again was something that Bob was rightly touching on with respect to his connection with Augustine. And we read Flannery O'Connor reaffirming that, quote, dogma is the guardian of mystery. We can see that she had learned the lesson of Aquinas and Newman. It is also respect for mystery that informs Aquinas' understanding of the primacy of the theological virtues. For what the Catechism calls the, quote, pledge of the presence and action of the Holy Spirit in the faculties of the human being. Thus, in the moving introduction of his compendium, Aquinas says, the whole perfection of this present life consists in faith, hope, and charity. This is the apostles' arrangement, which for that matter right reason imposes. Love cannot be rightly ordered unless the proper goal of our hope is established. Nor can there be any hope of knowledge if the truth is lacking. Therefore, the first thing necessary is faith, by which you may come to a knowledge of the truth. Secondly, hope is necessary, that your intentions may be fixed on the right end. Thirdly, love is necessary, that your affections may be perfectly put in order. All of Newman's beautiful, profound ruminations on how the affections apply in our apprehension and conduct of the faith jive with St. Thomas's. I'm writing a book called Newman and Saints, and I have a whole chapter on this very matter to show how profound an influence St. Thomas had on Newman in this regard. Also, Bob touched on this as well. We don't have the faith that we have because we've been given propositions or arguments. We have the faith that we have because we have the love that we have. This is something that Newman gets preeminently from Aquinas. Faith, hope, and charity also animate Newman's work in his last published reflections on the historian of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon. One can hear the critic in him, or perhaps one should say the priest, almost wishing that the historian had somehow found a way to perceive the Christian reality that he could not perceive in his account of the rise of Christianity. There's a kind of solicitude in Newman's strictures, a pastoral solicitude. You always get the sense that he's got Gibbon in his oratory, and he's trying to say, look here, Gibbon. I'm being asked to move along here. There's one half page left, and you will all be given great big badges for your patience. One can hear the critic in him, or perhaps one should say the priest, almost wishing that the historian had somehow found a way to perceive the Christian reality that he could not perceive. There's a kind of solicitude in Newman's strictures, a pastoral solicitude. Here he's not so much censuring as lamenting aloud the gift of historians' failure to see the real import of the rise of Christianity, which his Enlightenment history so thoroughly overlooks. It is very remarkable that it should not have occurred to a man of Gibbon's sagacity to inquire what account the Christians themselves gave of the matter, Newman says. Would it not have been worthwhile for him to have let conjecture alone and to have looked for facts instead? Why did he not try the hypothesis of faith, hope, and charity? Did he never hear of repentance towards God and faith in Christ? Did he not recollect the many words of apostles, bishops, apologists, martyrs, forming one testimony? No, such thoughts are close upon him and close upon the truth, but he cannot sympathize with them, he cannot believe in them, he cannot even enter into them. Instead, Gibbon delivered himself up to the direction of what Newman nicely called a godless intellectualism. And again, in the absence of the Church's great tradition of faith and reason, this is what we have in our universities today. Positively poisonous, godless intellectualism. For Newman, the same intellectualism is at the root of the limitations and incoherence of the secular university. Unconverted, neither Gibbon nor the university could hope to accomplish what ought to be their true objects. Why? If the Catholic faith is true, Newman wrote with a matter-of-fact decidedness that so rankled his critics, a university cannot exist externally to the Catholic pale. You could just imagine how this went over with his 19th century Protestant critics. For it cannot teach universal knowledge if it does not teach Catholic theology. Of course, one again thinks of poor Hesburgh. To end what I began, we should all be grateful to Pope Leo XIV for naming Aquinas and Newman co-patrons of education. Their witness to the real purpose and value of education will only strengthen and revitalize Catholic education, the essence of which Aquinas captures so finely in his Summa Theologiae. This is a very short but brilliant passage from that massive book. Man's ultimate happiness consists in a supernatural vision of God. What a splendid statement. Nobody can arrive at this end except by learning the way from God. What could be simpler than that? Every man that hath heard and hath learned from the Father cometh to me. Again, Thomas's frequent reliance on Scripture. The discipline has to be undertaken gradually, not suddenly. That is the characteristic for educating human nature. At the beginning lies belief. As Aristotle remarks, a learner must take things on trust. A disciple must accept what his master teaches him, as indeed did Aquinas. And so belief in God is necessary preliminary to the perfect vision of happiness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your wonderful patience.
I guess I'll go right to the point of an opening question, and then if others in the audience would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. As I was listening to both talks, I two words were bubbling to my consciousness. In your talk, Bob, unsurprisingly, given the title, the question of the heart, and really thinking about Newman as eminently heartfelt as a thinker. And in your talk, you began by thinking about reason and Newman as sort of eminently reasonable as a thinker. And I wonder if maybe as by way of the two of you almost commenting on each other's talk, if you could say a little bit more about the connectedness between being a heartfelt thinker and a reasonable thinker, and how you think Newman brings those two sides together in his thinking. Maybe if you don't want to start.
You know, whenever I teach Augustine's Confessions, I ask the students at the beginning, what does Augustine mean by the term heart? Our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. And I often say, I'll ask again at the end, and I never have an answer myself. I think what it means is the totality of the person. You know, it's not feeling, it's not even a soul, it's not the mind. The heart is who you are, and your wholeness as a creature. And I translated 2 volumes of analysis, one a history, one a biography of St. Thomas by the Swiss Jean-Pierre Tourelle a few years ago. And I noticed, and this is the connection to Aquinas, I noticed in his analysis of what Thomas did, he said what kept Thomas going in those thousands and thousands of pages that he wrote. Now, you students, I heard some people couldn't come tonight because it was a paper due, but Jay's got a paper due. I mean, you understand what it's like to write a paper, right? But it's estimated that Aquinas wrote the equivalent of 10 single-spaced pages a day for decades. What keeps a person going, doing it? Now, we know that Aquinas is a big brain, but that's the big heart. You know, why would he keep going day after day after day unless he thought it was worth knowing who God was through those analyses and wanting to convey them to others? I'm a third-order Dominican. You know, there's a phrase that the Dominicans use to transmit to others things that have been contemplated. And for me, one of the reasons I love St. Thomas is precisely that, which I've tried to do in my own modest way in my life. And I don't think you can be a Catholic without having an aspiration to understanding, but understanding not only here, but also here.
You've asked a very good question, Matthew. I think when we're looking at Newman's thinking, we have to appreciate that this was someone who was not only a writer, but he was also a fiddler. He had a great abiding love of music, and he once actually referred to thought as music. All music, he said, was thought. And I think that each of us, in our own way, regardless of which music we find most moving, have the experience that when we're moved by music, it's appealing to us in ways that transcend rational argument. And I think that this is where the heart and mind in Newman comes out most brilliantly. And just for one quick example, another similarity he has to Aquinas, which I couldn't include in that over-long talk as it was his preoccupation with dogma, and which is a preoccupation that St. Thomas has as well. And I think one of the difficulties that Newman faces in defining that and coming to grips with it and really trying to do it justice is precisely because he sees a great deal of feeling in that as well as thought. So you've asked a very good question. We could be here for days going into that, but I think that one has to, from my standpoint, it's very important to realize that yes, in one sense, perhaps Newman is an intellectual, but he's not just an intellectual.
I'll be scanning to see if anyone would like to ask a question, so please feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, a father's influence on one's faith, especially for a man, are significant. There's no doubt about that. I'm curious, for example, St. Albert had a huge effect on Aquinas. Ambrose had a huge effect on St. Augustine. What would you say would be the male figures, behavioral figures, that had an influence on Newman?
You're the biographer.
I don't know if I'm a biographer. I did write a book on Newman and his family, and one of the interesting chapters in that book is on Newman's relationship with his own father, who, as Bob explained, was a private banker in cosmopolitan Lombard Street after the Napoleonic, during and after the Napoleonic Wars. And as Bob shared with us this evening, his father's bank failed. And this was devastating to the family. Newman was one of 6 children, and it had a huge impact on the family. So I would say that the male figure, interestingly enough, who might have had the greatest influence on Newman in a way that he never quite could bring himself to articulate, but which nevertheless is all over the place in his works, was his father, precisely because his father had this experience of failure. And as far as Newman is concerned, we only develop spiritually in the faith by wrestling with our failures. It's a very profound theme in his life. Many others influenced, and actually personal influence is a very big part of Newman's whole approach to the faith. But I would say his father had a very big influence on him in that respect.
Well, just 2 sentences. He also was a man of great friendships. If you read the Apologia, the men, and they were men, who were around him in Oxford, particularly the guys who were a little bit more senior than he was, it really had an influence on him as well. I mean, you can tell that he admired certain people. He wanted to kind of imitate what they were able to do. The fact that he was even elected to Oriel College was for him, a great thing. So he was in a kind of a tradition that was reinforced by friends. He was supported up to a point by his father, of course, too. And I thought he was very successful in being elected to Oriel College. But I don't know, I mean, maybe you know this better than I do, Edward. I don't recall, he writes a bit about his father and his family in various places, but I don't see a kind of a dominating figure. Maybe I'm being too psychoanalytic about this, but I don't see quite the same thing that you were talking about with St. Ambrose and St. Albert.
Well, since each of you got to Newman through another figure, Augustine and St. Thomas, let me ask this question without trying to make Newman to be greater than that, but in terms of the Augustinian spirit, or in terms of the Thomistic spirit, are there ways in which you think Newman actually surpasses those two, one or the other, those two fingers? Does he bring something of that Augustinian spirit that wasn't there before, as it were, or the Thomistic spirit that wasn't there before? Or is he just a kind of disciple of them? I guess, just trying to think, does he surpass them in any way?
Let me take a crack at this. Look, I mean, it's a little slower on you, Matt, but it's a little vulgar to say, does somebody surpass figures like Aquinas and Augustine. I forget who it is. I didn't read every word, unfortunately, in my paper, but somebody said that just as Augustine was the great Christian mind of the ancient world, and St. Thomas of the medieval world, Newman is the great Christian mind of the modern world. I think the one contribution that he makes that they don't have is this idea of development, you know, which was very much in the air already with Hegel and whatnot in the early 18th century, or late 18th century, early 19th century. And the way that a living faith has elements that are stable across time, dogmas, principles, etc. Although I want to say, really, if you want to deal with some of the problems in the church right now, read his marks of what constitutes an authentic development as opposed to corruption. Because it's not just some kind of progressive development that development is. Authentic development is something, you can tell in your own life when something that you kind of almost knew was going to happen in the past finally comes to fruition, and you can say, that was what I was just dimly aware of at the beginning and came forward. I don't know that anybody besides Newman has refuted this idea of Protestant fundamentalism as, yeah, we ought to go back to these absolutely primitive forms of Christianity, as if the Holy Spirit is not going to lead you into all truth. That's what Jesus himself tells us. And that the faith is going to become richer, deeper, more inclusive, but also by remaining faithful to the original deposit of our Lord in Revelation. I could be wrong about this, but I have the feeling that is the one way in which I wouldn't say that he surpasses the others. They have other concerns.
Yes, I would certainly thoroughly agree with that. You know, the interesting thing about the idea of development is that in one sense, this is an argument that is mounted initially to counter the old, vulgar, no-popery contention that Catholicism was a kind of corruption of the primitive church, that these were accretions that had been put willy-nilly on top of the primitive church by a corrupt Roman clergy. And of course, Newman uses development to make the argument, no, this is the way a living body of faith grows, just as we grow as living beings. That is, as Robert just said, you know, he knows theology much better than I, but I think that as a theological explanation for the development of doctrine, it's just brilliant. That's a book that I would highly recommend. Newman writes theology in a way like no one else. It's actually it's a thrilling read, and they're good editions of that. So I wouldn't say, I mean, the idea of anyone surpassing St. Thomas Aquinas, I don't know about that. Newman would probably regard himself as not having been fit to black the boots of the angelic doctor. But I do think, I agree with Robert that the idea of development is a great contribution to theology.
Forgive my vulgarities.
You were talking a little bit about how, well, actually, you both mentioned it, how Newman sort of attempted and maybe attempted to find Thomas in Catholic universities and could not in some way. I was wondering if he had read Richard Hooker at all, and because Hooker's often sort of held up in Anglican circles as kind of the admittedly pale reflection of St. Thomas
Yes.
Aquinas.
He did read Hooker, yes. He didn't have much, he did read Hooker, the Ecclesiastical Polity. He didn't regard it as anything to write home about. It isn't really anything to write home about, truth to tell. you know, Newman spent a lot of time, again, as Bob said, trying to put theological Anglicanism in some sort of respectable light and failed. I've never really seen Newman as a kind of Anglican Newman and then a Catholic Newman. I think that all along, when he's an Anglican minister, he's a latent Catholic. He spends all of those years as an Anglican complaining about the lack of bona fides that his own Anglican faith has. So I don't think that he would have seen Hooker in a favorable light. He did try to find some Anglican theologians in a favorable light, but in such a strenuous way. I mean, he actually mocks that in some respects in the Apologia. He was very unsparing with what he retrospectively saw as his own errors when he was an Anglican. I mean, the whole Via Media, which was a kind of paper religion cobbled together between Rome on the one hand and Protestantism on the other, he will disavow and repudiate in the strongest satirical terms possible. It's funny, you know, when he was made a doctor of the church, there was all this talk of ecumenism. I'm sorry, but Newman's not an ecumenist.
You know, this is odd for us as Catholics living right now, but when Newman came into the church in the 19th century, St. Thomas was not being studied in universities. I'm not tooting my own horn when I say this because I discovered it as I was writing my book, A Deeper Vision. It's only because of Leo XIII that we recovered Thomas to the extent in the church that we have right now. I mean, prior to that, it's kind of hard to say what was being taught in Roman universities, but it's kind of Kantianism, you know, German idealism, something like that. And you know, Newman was mistreated a lot by the church in England, but when he got to Rome, he was also a bit disappointed because here he thought he was going to actually enter into that Latin natural law tradition that we were talking about, that was in Hooker and whatnot. But it's because of Leo XIII. I was in Rome when Leo XIV was elected last year, and when we heard his name, I said to myself, you know, he's looking back at Leo XIII, who encouraged the study of St. Thomas, not as antiquarians, but as a means to bring forward the wisdom that Thomas was able to draw out of the ancient world. And Augustine, I mean, Thomas quotes Augustine more than any other figure. We think it's Aristotle, but it's actually Augustine that he quotes more than any. And he brings those two traditions that I was talking about, that kind of Platonic Augustinian tradition and then the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition together. Leo encourages this, and as I trace out in my book, all of a sudden, all these scholarly quarterlies and whatnot, they get founded. Different places of study get founded all around the world. And this tremendous outpouring of neo-scholasticism, to the point that when Vatican II begins, people are feeling a little bit choked by how much scholasticism, neo-scholasticism is around the church, and of course jettison a lot that they shouldn't be jettisoned at that point. But it's an interesting study in intellectual history that Newman had to seek that stuff out in unfavorable circumstances as he came into the Catholic Church. And a lot of non-Catholics still believe that Catholics have always thought that Aquinas was the only main theologian. That's not the case. It's worth actually looking into because it shows how even the influence of one pope can make an enormous change in the way the church understands itself. And that's why a lot of people are nervous with recent papacies as well. Me among.
When think about the relationship between Augustine and Aquinas, I'm thinking about their different emphases on the faculty of memory. For Augustine, memory is so foundational alongside the intellect and the will. Aquinas, for lack of a better term, downplays it, puts it with the sensory faculties, not the rational faculties that distinguish humans from animals. I was wondering what your opinions and thoughts were on the role of memory for Newman, particularly as he relies on memory for the apologia and kind of, as you mentioned, not seeing that split between old Newman, new Newman, Anglican, Catholic, but kind of that rejuvenative role of memory in his theology and divinization.
Well, I would just say, if I understand your question, memory does play a profound influence in Newman's life for many reasons, but for one reason, I would say he's deeply, deeply affected by the death of his sister Mary, who died when she was 19. And by all accounts, Mary had a saint in her. Certainly Newman was convinced that she had. And in his sermons, for example, there are several sermons written around the time that he is trying to make sense of the loss of his beloved sister. And he brings her influence to bear in apprehending the life to come, really. So I think in that sense alone, memory plays a huge impact on him. And if you go, for example, to the Birmingham Oratory and you see his chapel in his room, you can see that around the tabernacle there are photographs of all his friends. Robert made the excellent point that Newman had a kind of genius for friendship. And he remembered all the dates of the birthdays of his friends. And this again is a great expression of how memory really animated his daily life.
Yeah, I think that the technical question that you're talking about, the way the memory operates in the souls of Augustine and Aquinas, is a very complicated question, of course. I would just say that sort of on an operational level, Newman's recovery of the early church, his study of the early fathers, depends on memory, recalling what the church has been in the past and how the church in the present, the Anglican church that he was in then, how that was and was not consonant with the early days of the church, even allowing for the growth that development is going to allow. And when he said that I have a work to do in England, when he was delirious in Sicily, it's not clear, maybe you have a sense of this, Edward, but it's not clear that he even knew what he was saying at that point. And what the work turned out to be was recovering what the actual early church was, that the Protestants claimed was what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
And what he actually recovered, the true memory of what the church was, he began to realize how much had actually been lost. He also, I would give him a little bit more credit than maybe you do, by going back to look at what the original Anglican founders were trying to do. He kept trying to read the 39 articles of Anglicanism in a more Catholic way, because he thought that the people who wrote those intended it to be done that way. But at a certain point, as you know, we all know that phrase, if he was to be deep in history, is to cease to be Protestants.
Just one little point I would add to that. Yes, look, Newman is certainly acting in good faith when he's trying to put the Anglican donkey back on his wall. There's no question about that. But I think it's fair to say that he realized that the Catholic Anglicanism that Elizabeth, for example, might have been trying to pass off to unify a disunited, I should say, England, was bogus. I'll never forget seeing Jack Scarisbrick one day in his place in England, and he's showing me one of Elizabeth's letters when she was dying, Queen Elizabeth, in which she referred to her Anglican priests as hedge priests. Very, very interesting use of language my view is that Newman becomes a hero to the English for many reasons, but I would say one of the big reasons he becomes a hero to them is that he has got the courage to stand up and say that this Church of England is a fraud, is a sham. And I think that a lot of his countrymen agreed with him on that, and they actually applauded his being foursquare about it.
Well, I think we should maybe get some beverages, some refreshments. I have one final, I wanted to ask you about conscience, but didn't get there. I wanted to talk about Vatican II and Newman and Vatican II, we didn't get there. Wanted to talk about why an Englishman for our age, we didn't get there. But let me ask one final question, top of your head. Newman should be known as the Doctor Blank. We have Augustine as the Doctor of Grace, Aquinas as the Angelic Doctor, or as John Paul II called him, the Doctor of Humanity. How would you fill in that blank, Robert?
Two choices. Doctor Veritatis, Doctor of Truth. Or maybe, I don't know the Latin word for development. I'm trying to think of what that would be. No, not evolution. It's interesting. He didn't get
Progressive.
Yeah, he didn't get a special title. So maybe that's.
Well, I'm bringing out a
Just
book.
one word.
I would actually agree with Robert. I would say he's a doctor of truth. He's the servant of truth.
Thank you both. Let's give a big round of applause.